So good afternoon and welcome everyone to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and it is my honor today to be hosting the renowned futurist and evolutionary economist Hazel Henderson. She's a longtime friend, colleague, and fellow traveler. She's a
Mm.
world-renowned futurist, evolutionary economist, worldwide syndicated columnist, consultant on sustainable development, and author of Ethical Markets, Growing the Green Economy, which informed the Green New Deal. And she's also co-author of the Henderson Quality of Life Indicators. I still have my copy from 20 years ago.
Oh, good.
Yes. And 7 other books. And her articles have appeared in over 250 journals, including the Harvard Business Review, LA Times, Le Monde, the Australian Financial Review, and others. And she has been one of the top 100 thought leaders in trustworthy business behavior. So she has a wonderful background, has been a board member of the World Watch Institute, the Calvert Social Investment Fund, Social Investment Forum, and the Social Venture Network. And she's the television producer for a public series called Ethical Markets. She's also taught at UC Santa Barbara and Berkeley, and she has spoken at a few different Praxis conferences over the years. So we are very happy to have you with us, Hazel. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Georgia. It's an honor for me, and it's wonderful to meet you all.
Great. Well, I wanted to start with a story about your background, which we discussed a little bit yesterday, because it's so important, I think, to what you've come to with your work. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing in Bristol and how that influenced your interest in economics.
Oh, yes. Well, yes, I grew up in Bristol, UK, and Bristol, as you probably all know, was the second large port for the slave trade. The other was the port of Liverpool. And I remember walking to school um, past the statue of Edmund Burke, the father of conservative thought, and the statue of Edward Colston. And I must say that it was quite gleeful for me to see the current generation of Bristol citizens pull Colston off that plinth he was on and drag him down and throw him in the muddy water of Bristol Port. So, the Britain back then, I hope it's much better now, was extremely patriarchal. And I learned at a very early age that money, and we were going to talk today about fixing the money meme. And before I get into discussing the money meme, I learned very early in my family and in the British society that money was a power tool. And basically, that was because my father was a typical patriarch, and his house, our house, was his castle, and he kept my mother totally penniless, even though he was a big executive and ran a company with 4,000 employees. Um, she had to grovel for every penny to pay for our grocery bills. And we had this Friday night ritual where my mother would present him with the grocery bill, and that would be his trigger to go off on a wild tantrum and hitting her and striking out at any of us who were close enough to um, get in the way. And that was kind of the Friday night ritual. And I remember I and my sister, we were kids of 6 and 7 years old, and we would say to my mother, well, look, let's run away. And she would say, we can't, darling, because I don't have any money. And so I learned at a very early age that I wanted to study money as a tool of power and oppression. And most of my work began by studying the non-money economy. And basically, I called it the love economy. And I knew that it was the other side of all of the production that was going on in the town that we lived in, because my mother, who was a wonderful, wonderful mother to the four of us. She also served on Meals on Wheels and the Well Baby Clinic and did all kinds of volunteering in our town. And it made me realize that, hey, all of these oppressed women were actually the backbone of the economy, and they were enabling the men to go out and earn the money. If somebody wasn't home raising the kids and doing the housework and all of that. So I drew a picture to illustrate what I thought was most economists missed. And it was a picture of what I consider the total productive system of any society, particularly even industrial societies. And that's the visual I have. And if you want to throw it up there, John,
And
um,
that's the love economy. That's
yeah, the love economy. And it's gone. That book I wrote called The Politics of the Solar Age. That is in 800 libraries around the world. And that diagram, which I drew actually for my daughter, and I can remember my daughter at age about 11 came into my room one day and saw me typing away, and she said, "Mom, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to straighten out the economic model and fill in all the gaps, that from the economic textbooks don't look at." And so basically, the top layer, of course, is the private sector, and that's conducted in money. We all love that. And the public sector, of course, you can't have a private sector without a public sector and, taxpayer supported schools and colleges and R&D and all of that. And then there's the cash economy, a little kind of layer under there. But then there's these two lower layers that support that cake. And the third one is that love economy, all of the unpaid work, which I finally got the UN, that has the UN Development Program has the UN Human Development Index. And by 1995, I got them to do the first study that estimated the size and scope of that love economy, the unpaid economy. And in 1995, they estimated that the unpaid work of men and women that was completely missing from the GDP that year amounted to $16 trillion with a T. And 11 trillion of it was the work of women, and 5 trillion the work of men, in terms of building housing and all kinds of farming and whatever. And of course, if that had been added to the GDP that year, instead of being 24 trillion, which was the official number, it would have been 40 trillion. But of course, no one was adding in the layer that made the whole thing work, which is nature's layer. And that was completely out of the picture. And yet we now know that the mess we're in with climate change and the loss of biodiversity, that we now are endangering the entire cake, the entire structure. So okay, you can pull that off now, and people can take that if they want it. But basically, that was the model I was working off, and so that became a very important part of my life. And the books that I have written since have been trying to look at all of the money-based metrics that officially run our societies. And of course, GDP, as you know, is a cash flow model. It's all conducted in money. Anything that's not conducted in money doesn't get into GDP. So it was very interesting because I became an activist when I became a naturalized American citizen. I moved over here and became a citizen in 1963. And the first thing I realized was that the air in New York City was really not very breathable. So I started a group um, called Citizens for Clean Air. And that was about the time when Senator Robert Kennedy was running for Senate in New York. And we became connected with him, and we took him on a helicopter ride around New York City to show him all of the pollution coming from the smokestacks, and every individual brownstone house had its own little incinerator that cooked the garbage and created all of this pollution in the air. And we told him that the basic goal of our group was to correct the GDP. And we wanted it to include subtracting the bads from the goods, because the GDP considered the pollution and all the other bads to all were all wrapped up in the same number. And so we said, could we have a net GDP where we would subtract all the bads like pollution? And Kennedy then went on to make his wonderful speech in 1968 at the University of Kansas, talking about how terrible GDP was. So, so one way and another, I'm still fighting that battle. And there was a conference I was invited to help organize at the European Commission in 2007 called Beyond GDP, just up my street. So yes, I definitely got involved with that. And I can remember on the organizing committee, there were all of these commissioners, of the European Commission. And I was saying, well, we do have to do a survey to see if ordinary people understand what's wrong with all of these money-based statistics that miss out on all of the important things in the love economy and completely ignore nature. And so they said, oh no, Hazel, we can't afford to do that. So I said, okay, my company will pay for it then. So we did a survey with GlobeScan. We went 50-50, and we did the first survey in 12 countries, North, South, East, and West. And we had just two very simple questions, and we asked people in all of their separate languages, um, which of the following two statements do you most agree with? Statement number one, the cash money-based GDP is the best measure of overall progress for our society. And the second proposition was GDP should be expanded to include scientific data on health, education, and the environment, and poverty gaps. And so what happened was, in every single one of those 12 countries, that included like Russia and Kenya, all over the world, we got over 80% of the general public's favoring the proposition that GDP should be expanded to include actual scientific data. And we repeated it in 2009 and again in 2013. And we've just done another one. And we still find the same huge majorities all over the world that want the GDP expanded to include health, education, quality of the environment. So I realized that it takes a lifetime to change a paradigm.
And hopefully, now that we don't have so much time because of the climate crisis, which
Right,
we'll
right,
get to, but
exactly.
before we get to that, I have another question I want to put out to you. Because with so many people right now out of work and out of paychecks, we desperately need more stimulus checks in the economy. But we have the constant warning about accruing national debt or causing inflation. So I
Mm.
want you to explain why this is a bogus argument, and also how we can explain this bogus argument of the deficit myth to others who are totally believing this. I think it's
Yes.
important that we know how to explain to others as well as understand ourselves.
Yes. Well, Ellen Brown, whom you all know, she is our monetary expert. She's on our advisory board, and I'm on the advisory board of the Public Banking Institute. And so I rely on Ellen's expertise for a real deep dive into monetary theory and all the rest of it. But the part that relates to my work is best described, I think, by Professor Stephanie Kelton, who has a new book just came out about 6 months ago called The Deficit Myth. And Professor Kelton was the chief economist for the Senate Banking Committee for many years. And she explains in that book how the money meme, this conceptual prison that we all live in, was used as a tool of power by those politicians on the conservative side who read the old textbooks, which of course are all obsolete and incorrect. Um, and basically, the whole idea, what they would do is that any liberal or progressive member of Congress who introduced a bill to improve society in some way or other, expand the kiddies lunch program or food stamps or whatever, um, there would always be, where's the money coming from? Have you heard that? How many times have you heard that? you know, that's their mantra. And so they use the money thing. And she explains in the book how what they would do is say, okay, nobody can introduce a bill into the Congress unless they say what other program they're going to take the money away from. And the assumption, which is totally false, is that there's a fixed supply of money. And of course, now we know that money isn't scarce. We see it printed all the time on television programs. And all of those politicians who, up to the time of the pandemic, were saying, oh, we mustn't have deficits. This is going to be terrible. It'll burden our children. It's immoral. We have to have austerity. And suddenly now they're all saying stimulus, stimulus, stimulus. We have to have universal basic income. Oh my God, we have to have negative interest rates. And basically, of course, we must put more money into the economy because our economy is based on 70% consumer spending. And once everybody's disemployed, and the way we are now, if we don't keep up purchasing power and aggregate demand, we will not only fall into a deep recession, but it'll be a global depression, probably worse than we had in the 1930s. So what Stephanie talks about is all of these games that are played around the money meme, you know. What I love to talk about now I'm saying that we all know that money isn't scarce. And if you all saw 60 Minutes about 2 months ago, and they had Jerome Powell, who's the head of the Federal Reserve, on there. And the interviewer, he was talking about the need for stimulus because we must replace all of this purchasing power to keep up the aggregate demand to make sure that the economy doesn't fall into a recession. And so the interviewer, of course, asked the same idiot question, where's the money coming from? And so Powell said right there on camera, well, we printed, of course. That's what central banks do. They print the money. And he said, not only do we print it, the notes and all of that, that come out of the mint and the coins, but he said we also do it on our computer systems. And so basically, we all know now that all they do is move the decimal points. And so how is it that we're all still in this conceptual prison of the money meme when we know that the other half of the way humans transact with each other is relationships, what I call the love economy. All of that mutual aid, swapping, neighborliness, volunteering to help each other, and all the stuff that people are rediscovering now because of the pandemic. And so actually, I've got a little visual on that. If you want to throw that up, John.
Which one is
And
that, Hazel?
that's the one that's the blue planet picture with
Yep, give
the
me one sec.
yes. And I did this visual back in the year 2000 because I was asked by the head of the Latin American Development Bank to come and talk down in Santiago. We had 6,000 bankers. And he said, I want you to come and make a presentation about what you call the love economy. Because basically most of the countries in Latin America at that time were really operating on pure information-based exchange and very little, just rather like Africa is today, where there's still such an enormous amount of the voluntary cooperative sector and pure information-based trading, like now the Kenyans are doing. They bypass the banking system altogether, and they do everything on cell phones now. And so basically, it was really funny because I said, well, these 6,000 bankers, nobody's going to come and listen to me talking about the unpaid information-based economy. And I remember there were about 300 bankers there, and I threw this up, to sort of start things off. And I could see them. There was about 300 of them in the room, and I saw them one by one glazing over and tiptoeing away. you know? Okay, you can take that off there. But basically, these currency systems, all were the companions of the Industrial Revolution. And basically all currencies today are fiat currencies. In other words, they're not tethered to any kind of value at all. And the worst thing in the world would be to tether them back to gold. That would immediately create another recession. But it's very interesting. I've done an article comparing the cryptocurrencies that are, now there's about 1,300 of them traded on Coinbase in Switzerland. And so the point I made in an article, which is on our website, is that money is not wealth. And basically, it's a tracking and scoring system that's very useful. And just the same way as markets are very useful. Markets are useful and currencies are useful, but we have to understand where they're useful and where.
Oops. Just a second, Hazel. You accidentally got muted. Can you unmute yourself, Hazel?
Okay, yes.
Sorry about that.
Yes, so I'm not quite sure where I started getting muted, but anyway, so I'll stop there because I was sort of in the middle of saying something and I'm not sure now.
All right. Well, I wanted to go to another thing before we go to questions from the
Oh,
audience.
let me just finish on Stephanie Kelton's book.
Okay.
Yeah, what I need to finish on Stephanie's book, The Deficit Myth, is she's saying, of course, deficits matter, but so do the assets that they create. And this leads right back to yet another problem with GDP. And that is that it records all the debts, all of the public investments made in schools and hospitals and R&D and all of the stuff that we have to underpin our societies, all of the infrastructure, the airports, the roads, or whatever. And yet there is no balancing asset side. And so basically, what that means is that the debt to GDP ratio of every country in the world is overstated by about 50%, just with the stroke of a pen, you know. And I have been teaching at a business school in Brazil. And when Lula came in 2002, we decided to hold, a lot of my friends in Brazil at this business school decided we should hold a conference, which we put on in Curitiba in 2003, called the First International Conference on Implementing Indicators of Sustainable Development and Quality of Life. And at the end of this whole meeting, I presented the Calvert Henderson Quality of Life indicators, and we invited the people from Bhutan, and they came and presented the global happiness, the indicators, and all of that. And we had a press conference with all of the financial press, trying to get them to understand that Brazil had this issue that it was having to spend a terrific amount of taxpayer investment as a rapidly urbanizing society on airports, schools, hospitals, all of this infrastructure. And the Wall Street thought that Brazil's sovereign bonds had this gigantic debt to GDP ratio of over 100%. And they saw Lula come in and say, oh my God, there's a Marxist come in to Brazil, sell your Brazilian bonds and all the rest of it. So we went to the new finance minister that Lula had hired, and happened to be, lucky for us, a medical doctor. He didn't have all this nonsense in his head, all this magical thinking from the economic textbooks. And so he went up to the IMF and sat down with Anne Kruger and said, look, you have to allow us to put an asset side on our GDP to balance off all of these taxpayer paid investments we're having to make in our infrastructure. So she reluctantly agreed and said, oh, well, all right, it will be a pilot program. And what happened was, with the stroke of the pen, the Brazilian sovereign bonds debt to GDP ratio was cut in half. And suddenly, if any of you remember at that time, Brazil's bonds suddenly became the darlings of Wall Street. And they were oversubscribed. Everybody wanted Brazilian bonds. So you see, this is how stupid all this money-based stuff is. We have to get over it and get to science, use scientific indicators. Okay, thanks.
Okay, good. That was really a good explanation. And the last question, if you can be succinct, because then I know people have questions they want to ask you, but I thought this was really important. A few things that you mentioned in the paper that I read that I thought were important. One, that public investments equal future prosperity, which is what you're saying right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And that we also need to muster the political will to put markets and money in their rightful places.
Yeah.
But the last question I have for you is, you mentioned that both the climate crisis and COVID are the biggest market failures. And
Yeah.
talk about why the market can't solve these problems.
Oh, yes. I mean, this is the whole thing. You see, we're beginning to realize now that, and I've done a separate paper on this called Pandemic Priorities, Free Daily Tests for All. Which everybody's coming to realize that now, that you have to be able to test an entire population. You can't wait to test until people have got sick. That's how we got in the mess we're in. So basically, the point of my article really is saying that the two market-driven laissez-faire economies, the Britain and the USA, tried to solve the pandemic using markets and individual, and so what happened with that is we had states competing with each other to buy masks on the open market, and that the whole thing was a gigantic market failure. And of course, the market failure of climate change is because we didn't notice that we were destroying the bottom layer of that cake. The nature, we were just, taking down nature bit by bit. So the thing is that markets, the reason I call my company, which I founded in 2004, and I fund myself out of my royalties from the TV show and my books and all of that stuff. Basically, the reason I call it ethical markets media is because markets are a wonderful invention. And there are all kinds of places where markets and money are incredibly useful. And if I could can I just give one example, Georgia?
Sure.
We've talked about, and on our website, ethicalmarkets.com, you will see there is something called Ethic Mark Gems. And this relates to the fact that for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been working with NGOs who are trying to shut down blood-stained diamonds, conflict diamonds. And then I realized, well, actually, global gem mining itself is obsolete and completely unnecessary. And all over the world, there are little artisan laboratories that are creating chemically identical diamonds, rubies, all of these beautiful stones, because they're all made of carbon, as you know. And it just depends how long you cook it and at what temperature, whether it turns out to be a diamond or a ruby or a mineral or a sapphire or a tanzanite or whatever else you want. So I thought the best thing that we could do is to help create this market, this disruptive market of lab created precious stones, and compete with De Beers, which is a global cartel. I mean, 100 miners die every year. It's terribly polluting and all the rest of it. And so basically, we designed and trademarked the Ethic Mark Gems certification, and it's the only one in the world. And it certifies only gems not mined from Mother Earth. And so I knew that sooner or later, this would be a gigantic market that would disrupt global gem mining and basically shut it down. And that's beginning to happen now. And just last week, you may have noticed in The Guardian, there was a photograph of this billionaire in Britain who started a solar energy company called Ecotricity. And his next enterprise is called Sky Diamonds. And he is taking ambient CO2 out of the air and turning it into diamonds. So only markets could do that. So there's no way some government agency is ever going to do that. That was a beautiful market innovation. So that's where markets shine, is they're wonderful for innovation. And money is extremely useful when used properly. But the problem with the economic textbook model is that their idea of the perfect society, the most efficient society, and this is what Kenneth Arrow and Debreu got their Nobel Prize for, is what they call market completion. And their idea was that the most efficient society would be when every single human transaction must be conducted in money. And of course, that's just as insane as the socialist government I grew up under in Britain that said in its manifesto that all of the commanding heights of the productive economy must be owned by the government. And that's just as stupid. So what I try to do is to clean up the language and say there's nothing wrong with markets or money. It's basically in our cultural DNA. As Polanyi pointed out in his wonderful book called Ancient and Modern Economies, it came out in the 1950s, and he described the Kula rings, and these are the native people who live in the islands of the Pacific Ocean, and they would trade with their canoes between all of these different islands, trading their goods with each other, and the money they used was shells. So see, it's in our DNA, and that's where Adam Smith was correct. But unless it's nested in very, very strong rules and culturally enforceable, regulations, then we're really in trouble. So let's keep the two things separate. That the love economy doesn't need money. And then there's the market economy, which we want to keep to where it does the thing right.
All right. Well, this has been a wonderful experience listening to you, Hazel. There's so many questions I'm sure that everybody has. I've noticed that Ellen Brown has come in the room. And before I go to questions, I just want to ask Ellen if you have anything you want to say or if you want to wait.
Hey, Ellen, how are
Hi,
you, my
Hazel.
dear?
Great to hear you all. I was on a different Zoom, so I was late. So I missed the beginning. That was really interesting about Brazil. Did you write something on that?
Oh yeah, a long time ago though. I mean, yes, actually, it's on my. I have a site for all my archives called just hazelhenderson.com, and the article I wrote on all of that was called "Statisticians of the World Unite." And it was published by Interpress Service in 2003, and it's on that site. So it's a long, long time ago.
Okay,
It's
thanks.
lovely to see you, Ellen. Thank you for
Likewise.
joining us.
I can
So I want to shut up and hear from Ellen.
I can save you guys the time. By the way, I just linked the article in the chat. The
Okay, great.
statisticians of
Yeah,
the
a
world.
lot of these articles and books that Hazel is referencing will be in the chat box. I'm saving it, and I believe all of you can save it too. But if you need it from me, I am saving it and we'll edit the chat box later. So it's great to have you also with us, Ellen, and I want to have you separately for a presentation sometime soon, so we can talk about that another time. Now I want to see if we've got some questions from people who have been listening and are wanting to get some information from Hazel. So do we have any hands going up? I hope you know how to do it automatically.
I think Ellen was about to say something, but also
Well, I saw some interest in the cryptocurrency space. That was a Zoom call I was just on with a guy that's actually working with the World Economic Forum, setting up their cryptocurrency. You know that a central bank digital currency is coming.
Yes, of course. And I rely on you, Ellen, to keep us abreast of all of these cryptos that the central banks are doing. Is it not because they were so afraid of Facebook and Zuckerberg's Libra?
Yeah.
Yeah, but right now it's China, of course. China is coming out with theirs. And
yes.
This man that gave the presentation said 80% of countries are going to have central, they're coming out with their own central bank currency. So my question is, how do we make sure that it's in the public interest? Clearly it can be manipulated.
Yes. just as much as fiats. I mean, that's the whole thing. It's not much better than fiats, except, well, I mean, I think that most of us would agree that the good part about having central banks issue their own crypto directly is that we can cut out the middlemen, the banks.
Yeah, in fact, it will bankrupt the banks. It will bankrupt Wall
Oh,
Street.
yeah, it
As
will.
you can assume, everybody will run to, they'll prefer a central bank digital bank account
Yes,
because they'll
Ellen,
get some interest on it if they treat us the same as the banks. And
yeah,
there'll be no $250,000 ceiling, so the pension funds can put their money there. And if the big investors pull their money out of Wall Street won't have liquidity.
right,
But
yes,
and if the central bank central bank has the ability to, I would much prefer to see a treasury dollar or a treasury greenback, or a digital greenback. In other words, issued by the treasury instead of
mhm,
the central bank, which is obviously going to be part of this central bank network, which is going to be headed at the IMF with some sort of IMF digital currency as a reserve currency. That seems to be the plan. I mean, this
yeah,
Great Reset thing is frightening what they've got in mind. I'm sure you've all tracked some of that stuff. So that is what I'm thinking about now, and my challenge is how do we make sure that it would be great for everybody to get a UBI right in their digital account, but we want to make sure it's like Social Security, like no strings attached, nothing like you've got to get the vaccine or you've got to, your social credit score is attached to it or whatever. It's so easily
yeah,
manipulated as a control device. How do we make sure that we protect so this man we were talking to said that you actually can set up a cryptocurrency in a way that you've got all your, personal protections in there. So that was good to know.
absolutely. So there's, I'm actually a technical focused person who's been heavily invested in the space since, I don't know, 2011 when the Bitcoin white paper first came out. But to hear you guys talk about it is super fascinating, and to hear that the world banks and them are taking it seriously is super exciting. I wonder how much have you heard about decentralized finance, and has there been any discussion of that insurance protocol?
Now, John, I want to go in order.
Oh, you're right. Sorry, my bad.
People
So
who are-
I got excited. Sorry.
yeah, I know you did, and
well, yeah, let me just pick up a little bit on decentralized finance, because what I have been writing about for the last 30 years is all of the local currencies all around the world, and use these local currencies which exist everywhere as a leading indicator of how badly mismanaged an economy was by its central bank. And I sent Georgia one more visual, which I'd love you to throw up because it's the most important book in my library. And this is a catalog of all of the local currencies which were issued by every town and village in the United States and Canada, and many in Mexico, after the banks closed in the 1930s. And, I used to go around making lots of speeches at that time. And what I would always do, any town I was going to give a talk, I would go into that book, huge, big, fat book, and I would find the town that I was going to speak in, and I would find the page which had photographs of all the local currencies that that town issued in the 1930s. And I would throw them up on a screen. And I would ask the people in my audience, did anyone ever remember seeing these local currencies that your town issued after the banks closed in the 1930s? And there were always two or three people in the room would say, oh yeah, I remember those. Yeah, I remember seeing those in my dad's drawer and all of that. And this book, you can find a copy on Amazon. Last time I looked, it was about $950 if you want to buy your very own copy. But this is part of economic history, which has very much been suppressed. And the reason I love covering decentralized local currencies is because it helps to teach people about the nature of money. And if in their country, if the central croupier at the central bank isn't making enough chips for people to do their trades, then they make their own chips. You know, people are very sensible. So that was another way of making people understand the money meme, and hopefully releasing us all from this conceptual prison we've been in. Thanks. You can take that off now.
Okay, I'm going to go to some of the questions that are looming. First, we'll go to Gina and then Allison and then Ned. So Gina, do you want to unmute yourself?
I did. Hi. Hello. Hi. You know, my question has to do with what I consider to be when you talk about the love economy, but also one of the reasons I've come a little bit disillusioned around some of the nonprofits in the valley and the county is what I consider to be the exploitation. You could say the love economy, but can't we just find a volunteer to do it? We can't find, we have these high needs, these things that need to be done, but we can't hire anybody to do this. Trying to find, I years ago, because my background was in public relations and then I kind of retired from that, but I got really tired of people wanting me to volunteer my professional service. Well, we can't afford, but would you do this for us? Well, no, no, it's what I have to make a living through. And there's still a lot of that. I'm using that personal example, but I've seen that time and time again. And on so many nonprofit boards, they're so busy trying to attract wealthy people who they bring that attitude.
Okay. Yeah, well, they're still in the conceptual prison of the money meme. And you see, the whole thing is that what you're dealing with there is exactly what Stephanie Kelton points to in her book, and that is that anyone who tries in the Congress to fund the things that should be funded in the love economy sector, foundations, all the things that we need done, are being told, oh, no, there's no money. Where's the money coming from to do that? This whole idea that there was a fixed amount of money, and with the whole idea, was to starve the love economy sector and force people to go on volunteering. I mean, just like my mother did. She was an involuntary servant, and that's what's happening now with the COVID, is that women are still the ones having to drop out of the labor force and take care of the kids. So that's still part of the patriarchal model, where money is being used as a tool of oppression.
Right, very good. Okay, Allison, and then John, and then Ned. Allison? Well, she doesn't.
Hey, can I cede to John first, and then I'll thank you. I know he's excited.
Okay, John, you go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I was still trying to write a good question. Basically, I was going to ask, there are some maximalists in the decentralized space who think, centralized agencies are just period going to be a thing of the past. I wonder, where on the spectrum do you lie in the far as decentralization? With there's insurance and loan protocols and all types of things that are now being decentralized. If there were a ubiquitously trusted decentralized currency, do you see any place for things like banks or centralized agencies? I mean, what's the point if we can do it decentralized?
Oh, we can't do everything decentralized. I mean, that's what we discovered with the COVID virus. You do need, sometimes you need collective action. And in this society, this hyper-individualistic society, the Americans are wonderfully ingenious at the individual level, where you have all these fancy masks and everybody's figured out things to do individually. But in terms of collective action, we are completely hopeless at it. And, the only way to deal with this out of control virus now will be the Defense Production Act. And we'll have to get money into
Yeah.
the system where it's needed, I believe, to create these 50-cent saliva test kits, which everybody can have in their own home. And we can test ourselves 2 or 3 times a day if we need to. And the article I wrote there, this is based on a lot of new companies who are producing these 50-cent tests. And it was the FDA that was refusing to certify them because they wanted the 8 billion, of course, which went to the vaccines, then the big pharma companies. But now they have been certified. And the first real test of this is happening in Britain, in the city of Liverpool right now, where everybody in the city of Liverpool, of several million residents, will all have as many packages of these daily tests, so that when you wake up in the morning and brush your teeth, you also test yourself. And then if you want to go and have lunch with a friend, you test yourself again, and you call a friend and say, hey, did you test yourself again? Because this is the only way we're going to deal with this virus at this point. So the way I approach the centralization versus decentralization debate, which has been going on for thousands of years, is to talk about best practices and standards, like the global standard we created for gems that are not made from Mother Earth, stuff like that. So I am very much a supporter of the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals, because the best thing we can do as humans is agree on goals and principles and standards, and let that guide behavior at the local level, rather than creating bureaucracies when we don't need them.
Okay, Hazel, I think now we have Allison and then Ned. So Allison, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. It's really exciting to be in the room with all of you and hear your expertise and stories, and hearing just the story about Bobby Kennedy, having shared his talk with students for many years about the GDP, and the way that you phrased it is refreshing and exciting to me. And I'm actually glad you ended where you did, because I'm so filled with questions or desires to discuss that. Discussing the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, of course, are laudable goals all around this central goal of economic development, right? With the quintessential graphic of an upward, forever ending upward trajectory of GDP growth.
Right.
And so, of course, I resonate so much, Hazel. I've been so excited about teaching your work with students as I teach economics, but how to remember what the purpose of the economy is, and beginning with that purpose and what we're going towards, and using that as our indicators rather than the measurement as the goal, which is how much money is moving, right?
Right.
So gosh, what I've been teaching is that's the place that we need to focus in, because that's kind of what's causing all of the rest of it to spin out of control.
Yes, exactly. Well, I've been doing a lot of webinars with Arizona State University, and the last 2 I did in October. One was with my friend Vicki Robin, and a lot of you, I'm sure, know her book, Your Money or Your Life. And the other was with Claudine Schneider, the Republican member of Congress who introduced the first climate bill into the Congress in the 1980s, would you believe? And we titled it Steering Societies from GDP to the SDGs. And we talked about, these 2 ways that human beings have always transacted with each other, the relationship and the money model. and the usefulness of both in the right way of designing things. And basically, what I say now is that the GDP model encourages bad behavior. Money serves individualism. It's kind of been the tool of the hyper individualism and this whole idea of market completion, where everybody has to use money. And so I call the GDP model the 7 deadly sins model, which is accumulation and envy and greed and, you name it. And the SDGs really go back to the golden rule. And that's very much the relationship economy, that we all learn from our parents, taught our kids, and every traditions, and most spiritual traditions in the world have the golden rule as their basis. So I'm kind of shorthanding it that way right now.
Thanks, Hazel. We're going to go next to Ned. Do you want to
Hi,
unmute?
Ned.
Hello, Hazel. What a thrill.
Hi.
So, I haven't followed all your work, but I've been aware of it, certainly. And Herman Daly's work and Robert Costanza, who are ecological economists. So I'm working on climate work here in my town. And I'm wondering, where are we in the terms of integrating externalities into economic system? It's so difficult to find a way to pay for or to make the changes needed and produce savings people intrinsically want before they do anything to retrofit or sequester carbon and so forth. But we're trying to rebuild your nature layer at the bottom of this cake before it collapses. So when we avoid the cost, and when it collapses, how are we ever going to recreate ecosystem services after they're wiped out?
Yeah,
So,
you really can't. Yeah.
Yeah, so we need to invest in it now. So where are we in terms of trying to monetize some of those losses ahead of time?
Yeah. Well, this is a very dear to my heart, is making externality-based accounting fraudulent. I mean, it's fraudulent. And so I've worked a lot with accountants because they're right there in the real world. I can't deal with economists because, they have all these magic thinking formulas and things from their textbooks. But the good accountants that I work with talk about the 6 forms of capital, which is financial capital, built capital, which is factories and stuff like that, intellectual capital, social capital, human capital, and natural capital. And their model of looking at a corporation, they would look at the extent to which it has either enhanced or degraded all 6 forms of capital. And we have been putting out at Ethical Markets, we've been putting out the Green Transition Scoreboard ever since 2009, put it out every year. And basically, we have tracked all of the pure play green technology. And the companies that we think are the ones to replace all of those stranded assets now with fossil fuels. And every year we've had a different theme, looking at green bonds and green infrastructure. We had 1 year we did ending externalities. And we talked about full spectrum accounting as the basis for the green transition to what I call the solar age. And all of this has been moving along. And then this year, partly because of the pandemic, it's gone into overdrive. And it's very interesting that because everybody stopped traveling about March, oil prices, as you know, dropped to the negative range.
Right.
And then Exxon was kicked out of the Dow Jones Index, and suddenly the whole thing, the whole green economy model that Professor Jacobson has been leading us to quite rightly, suddenly became mainstream. And I was thrilled because I thought, oh, thank God, we don't have to go on publishing our green transition scoreboard, because now Bloomberg Green is doing it and Standard and Poor's, everybody else is doing it. And so I linked up with a group in London called South Bank Investment Research, and they have a model portfolio of pure play green companies, mostly small companies that have, kind of NASDAQ type companies. And it's called Exponential Energy Fortunes. And this guy that I work with there, I could not believe it, but he's been getting double-digit, triple-digit returns on his green portfolio. So he had a seminar for all of his investors back in April called Beyond Oil, telling them, for God's sake, get out of these fossil fuels because you're going to lose your shirt. There's going to be a bloodbath, because the capex has fallen off by 25% and the party's over. And then they asked me to do a seminar which we called The Birth of Big Green. so I mean, suddenly, oh my God, all of this has happened. And what I'm doing now is taking all of those 10 years of green transition scoreboards, and they're going to be an e-textbook for the current business school students, because it's called Mapping the Global Green Transition 2009 to 2020. And the reason I felt so missionary about making it available is because all of these guys, Larry Fink and all the people who go to the World Economic Forum are saying, well, guess what? The market worked, right? We have a green portfolio. We're doing an impact fund, and as if, okay, we don't need you guys to tell us what to do anymore. And I want those students to know that it took us 30 years dragging those companies kicking and screaming to what they're now doing. And even now, there's a hell of a lot of greenwashing going on.
Yep.
I mean, there's Larry Fink. He's supposedly managing 7 trillion of assets. He's still got $1 trillion tearing up the rainforest to provide for meat diets, and run cattle and grow soybeans for them to eat. And 80% of our arable land goes to feed cattle.
Right.
I mean, so we are watching now our last green transition scoreboard. We're tracking the 150 startup companies in plant-based foods and beverages that are going to put the meat companies out of business.
Great.
And the group, another group we work with in London, has 26 trillion of assets under management. They are a consortium of vegetarians, animal rights people, vegans, the Singapore Temasek, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and they're the ones that are putting all the money into these 150 startups, all these plant-based foods and beverage companies, and the alternative cell-based meat companies, and the ones that are going public, like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and all that. And here again, this is where markets are better. They're leading the way much better than, So what they've done is they're shorting 16 of the big meat producers. And they're saying, you better get out of these companies because you're going to lose your shirts. And so I love people, who will short the bad guys the same time that they're investing in the new market.
This is very, very interesting. I want you to mention one thing because I think it will surprise people, and it was something we spoke about yesterday. is you were invited to Venezuela and you had meetings with Hugo Chavez. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, in the year 2000, when Chavez was elected, he contacted a good friend of mine who's on our advisory board, who was the previous ambassador to India. And I'd been working with him for many years on getting the UNDP to do the Human Development Index. So we were old friends. And so Chavez called him. He was by that time starting a solar-based intentional community in southern Venezuela on the Brazilian border. And he got this call from Chavez, the new president, who said, I want you to head up a task force on the future of energy. And he said, I mean, not oil. I mean that the future of energy, there's only two kinds of energy, human energy or solar energy. And so my friend said, well, yes, Mr. President. So he calls me up and said, oh, my dear sister, would you co-chair this task force for President Chavez? I said, okay, yes, of course, So I went down to Caracas and I brought down a lot of venture capitalists with me who were investing in pure green solar energy, wind companies, energy efficiency and LED lighting, all this stuff. And so basically we produced this report where we said, well, we absolutely have to get off oil. And as you know, Venezuela invented OPEC and sold that idea to the Saudis. So here I am in Caracas at the Caracas Hilton at the opening of the second OPEC summit, which was held in 2000. And we're sitting there in this big ballroom, and there's all of the OPEC members there, the Iraqis and the Iranians and all of these people, And Chavez comes in, and we were all sitting there, and he said, oh, right, he said, these and all the people at PDVSA were there, their big national oil company. And so Chavez opens up by saying there's only two forms of energy, solar energy and human energy. And these people were, oh my God, what's happening now? So I ended up having a very nice one-on-one meeting at the Miraflores Palace. And that was when Chavez first came in. He was a very genial, delightful man. He gave me a little copy of his constitution, which was all about, getting into, microcredit and all kinds of really good stuff. And anyway, we all know what happened after that. It all went to pieces. And of course, Maduro was a bus driver, and he doesn't know anything about anything. And so once Chavez passed away, and he came over, it's just tragic. I mean, my friend is still there, off the grid, and determined to wait it all out and see what can come next. But Venezuela is a beautiful, wonderful country, and I love the Venezuelan people. And what's happened is just so tragic.
It's happened in a lot of places. So I
Yeah.
think if are there anyone else want to ask a question before we close up? I thought I saw maybe some.
I'd like to ask one, Georgia. Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Who is it?
I think that's Julie.
Julie has a very bad connection.
Can you
Okay.
hear me? No. Okay. Never mind.
You can write it in
It's a
the.
bad computer connection. I was just going to say, is she connected with Naomi Klein's work at all?
Oh, yes.
Oh, I love Naomi Klein's work. I love it. She's absolutely right on that. I've never met her, but she's wonderful.
Julie, you've got to mute. Okay, great.
She's muted now.
Yes, Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, The Climate versus Capitalism. I actually did a summary of that book that is available to all Praxis members. If you don't have it, I would be happy to send it to you. Instead of 500 pages, this is 26 pages. So, and I think it grabs all the important points of the book. So I want to thank you, Hazel. This has been an extraordinary hour or hour and a half with you. And thank you, Ellen, for showing up too.
Rocky has a question if we have time.
Okay, Rocky,
Yes.
our last question then will be Rocky. Go ahead. Rocky?
He's unmuting right now. It looks like.
Unmute
thank you.
yourself, Rocky.
Yes, Ms. Henderson, this may be an antiquarian question, but stimulus monies, when pumped into the economy, they must affect inflation?
Well, now Ellen's really good on this, but also Stephanie Kelton's been making the point that the only way you get inflation is if there aren't any actual people on the ground and productive facilities that can be, brought into being. Would you say that, Ellen?
There's Ellen.
Yeah, yes, I agree. And I would, first of all, if you've got supply going up with demand, obviously you don't have inflation. So if you create stuff with the money, you're not going to have inflation. But the other thing is you've got this enormous amount of debt out there. And so a lot of that money is going to go to pay off the debt. And money is created as a debt and it's extinguished when the debt is paid off. So paying off debt is not inflationary. It just gets rid of the debt, which we know is a huge burden and a drag on the economy. And
Ms. Brown, thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. See, Ellen is our leader on all of these issues. She takes a much deeper dive into all of this monetary stuff, and I rely on Ellen.
And I rely on you. Thank you very much.
We all rely on each other. We all learn from each other.
Yeah.
This is
And Georgia.
Wonderful. So I want to thank you so much, Hazel, for spending this much time with all of us and explaining all these things and telling us your stories as well. And Ellen for chiming in and being with us too. So we have recorded the entire event today and it will be available to all of you who are here. Just let me know if you want the YouTube link to our channel and I will send it to you.
And anyone who wants any of my articles, they're all free and downloadable at ethicalmarkets.com, including all of our green transition scoreboard reports, all of our TV shows are all free on demand on that site. So
and that link is in the chat. So
yes, that's in the chat.
Oh, it's in the chat. Okay.
Yes, and I'm saving the chat and that will go to everyone also. And hopefully you can save it yourselves in case I don't get it to you. But anyway, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful afternoon with you.
Oh, I'm so happy. Enjoyed it. Great to see you, Ellen.
Likewise.
All of you.
You
And
too.
thanks
Glad you're
again.
hanging in
Thanks,
there.
Georgia, for arranging this. I love you, Georgia.
Love
Thanks
you
for
too, Hazel.
doing
This
this.
has been wonderful.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
I wonder if